Welcome, listeners, to the true iteration of That's a Good Card. Today, Kyle will have the challenge of getting me to say, "That's a good card." While Kyle will be doing the convincing, I'll be playing the devil's advocate. Also, now is a good time to remind you to hit that subscribe button if you're listening to us on YouTube, and please leave a comment below with your suggestion for our next card. All right, Kyle, let's get started. What did you bring to us today?
Yeah, so today I have a fun little card that just came out pretty recently in a new set. It's called Lively Dirge. So Lively Dirge is a 2-cost card, 1 and a black. It's a sorcery, and it has spree, which means that there are multiple additional costs that you can use to cast it. You don't have to do both. You can do one or the other. The first one is for 1 extra generic, and it says search your library for a card, put it into your graveyard, then shuffle. The second spree option is for 2 extra generic, and it says return up to 2 creature cards with total mana value 4 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So, where have we seen Lively Dirge played? And the answer to that is kind of some interesting deck lists. So, obviously, first and foremost, this is a Korvold card, right? This is where I originally saw this card and was exposed to this card, was looking at different new Korvold lists. And while adapting my own list, I saw that this was being played by Eric, the Mad King, who is the best Korvold player in my personal opinion, and probably a lot of the Korvold Discord's opinion.
Yeah.
I've seen the most tournament success. So Eric is currently on this card. I reached out to him directly to see what his thoughts are on this card currently, because I know his list is changing a lot. So he seemed to think that this card was pretty solid. I think that the general consensus on it is that it's a great enabler for Dockside, but you can also find some other cool tech like Dosan or Technomancer through it, which is pretty awesome. The second list that we've actually seen some play for Lively Dirge is Malcolm Vial Smasher. So there was a deck list that I believe got 5th in one of the recent tournaments, and they were playing Lively Dirge, and I think the reason why is just to be able to grab Glinthorn, right?
Yeah.
So if you're playing any Malcolm deck that also plays black, I think that this card's pretty sweet because you can just get that Malcolm combo off, right? So you grab a Glinthorn Buccaneer and you can win the game. The other lists, so besides, those are like the 2 main lists that have like seen success, like consistent wins from what I was looking through some of the tournament results. There's also some other lists that I saw had this card in, but haven't really seen a lot of tournament success with it. And those lists are Keurig, Tayam, the Master, and then Dargo Timna. So a little bit of Mardu in there. Most of these decks, it makes sense for them to want Lively Dirge just because there are a lot of graveyard decks, there are recursion decks, like they love going through the graveyard. They're probably already running Entomb, and this card at its floor is an Entomb, an expensive one, but is an Entomb, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that if you're playing a CEDH list that cares about its yard, I think you should take a look at Lively Dirge. Are you ready for me to get into my main points?
Yeah.
Cool. So the first point that I'll bring is that I really want to kind of just focus on the actual text of the card, because it is kind of a bit of a wall, just because Spree brings so many different options. I think the first thing of note when I was talking about this card with a friend is they didn't realize that the card that you search for can be any card. So it just says a card that you can search for. Notably, on the second part of the Spree, you are bringing back creatures only.
Yep.
But the first part says that you can get any card that you want and put it in the yard. So I think that's really, really important for any list that is on breach lines. So let's say, like, I did find a singular blue farm deck that was playing this. I think they only got 1 win in a recent tournament with it, but they were playing Lively Dirge. And it makes sense to me because they're on breach lines, and sometimes you have breach in hand and you just need like that LED in the yard or that brain freeze in the yard, and then you can win the game. So I think being able to flexibly find any card and entomb it is really important. You could also use that to interact with like another card, like an Eternal Witness, right? So you can just go entomb something and then bring it back with another card that lets you recur through that. I do understand that this is kind of just like an argument for like, yeah, guys, we know Entomb is a good card. Kyle, shut up, like move on. But yes, this is a really expensive Entomb at its lowest form. So that's just kind of my first point, is just taking a closer look at this card and realizing that there's a little more to it than meets the eye. It's like, not only can you just go get a creature, which is kind of like the linear plan for this, is like, let's go get a dockside and put him into our yard and then reanimate the dockside. And now we have a bunch of treasures, right? Like, I think that's the most simple line that this card could be good for. But that being said, I think that there is a benefit to being able to have that flexibility to just grab any card and it could interact in a different way than just a simple entomb a dockside, get a dockside.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I think it brings a lot of potential flexibility. Yes, obviously, everybody that's listening, there are cards that do this for cheaper, but I think when you brought this card to me, I was really keen on a red version kind of this card. Like, I kind of like the spree mechanic in general, and spree just lets you kind of have a lot of options. I play a card called Return the Favor, which is 2 red, and it lets you copy instance or sorcery spells or activated abilities or triggered abilities. So for 2 red and a generic mana, you can copy a dockside trigger, which is kind of insane, or you can change the target of a target spell. And so I think these cards in general and this kind of card mechanic is really neat. And so I totally see what you're saying. Like, the duality of it is kind of like really neat.
Yeah, I mean, we love flexibility in a card. We want the card to be able to perform in different scenarios. This is CEDH, and although there is a high amount of I guess you would say the same decks coming to tournaments and the same just seeing pods that look pretty similar, there's also in those early rounds, there's also a lot of diversity, right? Like, you have to get through some interesting decks before you start getting into the top 16 area where it's a little more refined,
right?
But you still have to get those early wins. And I think that it's important to have cards that are flexible for any circumstance, and this one is really flexible. So my second point, that's a really fun part of this card, is that it doesn't target, so your opponents don't really know what you're doing. And I think that this is something that we brought up in our bribery podcast before, which is like, this card's power comes from the unknown.
Yeah.
So your opponents aren't going to know what your plan is when this card comes down. So the best case scenario with this card, you already have a win in line, right? You cast this card and go grab a Grand Abolisher, or you go grab a Dosan, and now all of a sudden, because this card even resolved, your opponents thought that they might have another point of interaction. They had the counterspell in hand, but they let this card resolve. Now they are realizing the fault of their ways, and now, oh shit, I had interaction to stop this win, but now I can't because I didn't know what the hell they were going to grab off of Lively Dirge.
Right.
So I think that unknown factor of them not knowing what the hell you're going to get. And I mean, some people, this card, the problem with this card is that I think people could use it in a really nefarious way. I hate cards that can be abused, and I can definitely see if this card gains popularity, people being like, no, I'm not going to grab that. I'm going to grab this card. I'm going to grab this card. I'm going to grab this card if you let it resolve. And then they let it resolve, and then they don't grab what they say they're going to grab.
Well, yeah, I mean...
Yeah, and I kind of hate that, but at the same time, personally, if somebody asked me what I was going to grab, I wouldn't lie, but I also wouldn't tell them. I'd just keep my mouth shut.
Right, no, for sure.
But I think that this card could be abused in that way. But anyway, I digress. I think that the card is really powerful because of the unknown factor.
I totally agree. I think that is a really, like, basically when you put this on, you don't have to tell anybody anything. You don't have to say anything about what you're returning because it doesn't target anything. And basically once everybody passes on this, even if they, let's say you entomb a dockside. That dockside's coming back, right? If you've already paid for it, it's coming back. There's nothing anybody can do about it. They have to counter this right away. They cannot let it resolve because once it starts resolving, that's it. Your cards are coming back. And
in case the listeners don't really understand, because Spree's pretty new, like if you choose both modes for this card, there are no points of interaction between the modes.
Nope.
It's not like you can cast this card, goes around the table, it resolves. You grab a dockside, put it in their yard, and then somebody can like Deathrite Shaman.
Nope.
Or get rid of the dockside or something like that before it comes back. No, there is no point of interaction. Like the whole text of the card has to resolve first before there's any priority passed.
Yep.
So whatever you're grabbing, once this thing resolves, whatever you're grabbing is coming into play.
It's coming.
And notably as well, we haven't really talked about it, but you don't even have to grab or bring back what you're grabbing.
Nope.
If you already have great targets in your graveyard, you don't even need to use the first part of the spree. You can just grab whatever's in your yard. That's something that's really relevant as well.
I actually really like that because you can kind of bait it. You can
for sure.
You can pay it. Let's say you just have the mana. You're just going to look for whatever card, and everybody's going to be anticipating, like you said, like the subterfuge of pretending that you're going to put this really important card in, but like the whole time you're just trying to return.
You're just going to grab something from your yard. Yeah. You're just going to try to get your Grand Abolisher back that somebody killed earlier. Yeah. So yeah, I think that the uncertainty that this card brings is its most powerful asset. And a lot of times it's pretty cool because a lot of times you don't see that on sorceries.
Yep.
A lot of times sorceries I feel like are pretty straightforward, and a lot of the surprise factor of CEDH kind of comes from instance. But this is one of those cards that's still a big surprise, even though it is a sorcery. Cool. Let's get into my third point, which I think is my weakest point, but at the same time is its strongest point in a sense of it's the Magic Christmas Dreamland of this card. And I think that this card pairs perfectly with Culling Ritual. Like if you're a deck that runs Culling Ritual, man, is this card good. And it's just the perfect outlet because it's expensive. It's a bunch of generic mana, but that doesn't matter. You can pay it with black or green that you're getting off of Culling Ritual. And not only that, but you can potentially bring back the things that you're wiping on your own board, right? So if you have a Dockside on your own board and you Culling Ritual, like all of a sudden, like you can search for something else and still bring your Dockside back. Like that's so juicy. It's so good with Culling Ritual. It's the perfect wine pairing. I mean, it's the perfect card pairing. It's just incredible.
Yeah, it's pretty good. I think that would be a really great scenario to find yourself in.
Yeah, 100%. All right, yeah, that's my positives for this card. Short and sweet here. What are your downsides?
I'll be honest with you. My downsides are pretty short and sweet as well. If the listeners haven't noticed, I'm actually also rather high on this card. This type of mechanic is just really kind of neat. It just like I love that it's a low CMC, so you can play this card in a ad nauseam deck, right? It's only 2 CMC.
Yep.
It provides up to 5 mana value of worth, but they kind of hit it as a kicker cost. Essentially, that's what this is a 2 cost spell with a kicker. So I'm pretty high on it, but I do think that it does need to be pointed out that like it is kind of high to get the whole thing, right? To get that whole package, you're putting in 5 CMC. And so if you're on a deck that runs an ad nauseam, you're going to be with a very observant opponent is what I'm trying to say. They're going to be wary of what you're doing, and they may be passing and kind of waiting to see what you do with like all of this mana that you've been kind of like kind of saving, and it's just a lot to kind of invest, and you can kind of get blown out because like you said, it is kind of a win condition, and so you're going to want to make sure you're finding the right window to kind of make this happen, because at 5 cost, like that's a could amount to kind of, especially if you don't have that. It
could be an ad nauseam.
Right? It could be an ad nauseam, right?
It's like 5 cost, it could just be an ad nauseam. Yeah, 100%. I think that if you're playing this card at its full mana value, like it should be winning the game. And I think that the only lists that would run it, I think it does win the game for you if you're playing it for the 5 cost. I think that you're playing it in a world where you're set up for this to win you the game once it resolves.
Mm-hmm.
For the decks that would run it, like let's say you're even using it just for that linear line, even if you're paying 5 to go grab a Dockside, like maybe that Dockside's for 8, you know, and it just wins you the game.
Yeah, it's not bad.
Like it's something that is super relevant. But yeah, I get that it is a really high cost for the full package of what this card can do.
It's like going into a car lot and like you're looking for like, oh look, it's only this much money, and it's like, well, before you walk out of here, like we're gonna add this in and this in to kind of get the full value.
Yeah, exactly. You got to get the full package for this card to be worth it. You know, you think it's just 2 costs, but in reality, like there's some hidden fees for this card to reach its potential.
And the only other downside that I can really think about is it's a little bit slow. It is sorcery speed. And so, like, I think this card would be bonkers at instant speed.
Oh, yeah.
It would be just
yeah, that would
bonkers.
be disgusting. That would be absolutely disgusting. This would be like an $80 card if it were an instant. And probably already banned.
Yeah, and because like you do have to do this main phase, right? And so I think that that's the only real knock against this card. As I've said, like I'm kind of high on this card, and so it was actually really kind of a struggle to kind of like to find some things that I thought were not wrong with it, but like things that I would have to like kind of like, if I'm going to try to cast this card, like these are things that I would think about. Like it is kind of high cost. It's a little bit slower. I can't do this on somebody's end step to really kind of like get an edge and advantage. Like I'm going down 5 mana, and then if I have to protect it, then I've got to make sure I have the resources available for that, right, as well. So
yeah. And you can't just rip it either. Like, if you have no protection for this card, like, man, that would be bad if you tap out to try to Lively Dirge and, like, you have no protection whatsoever, and it just gets countered by, like, literally any of the counter spells because it's a sorcery.
Yep.
Like, that's a bad feeling. Main phase 1, I'm going to cast Lively Dirge.
All right, Swan Song.
Just get Spell Piercer, Swan Song. It doesn't matter, That thing is gone.
But I think you kind of started going down this route. Like I said, I only had those 2 points.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually kind of have a question. Is like, we've talked about it a little bit, and you've talked about what type of decks, but like what sort of decks do you think should try to slot this in? My first thought was like, and I don't know anything about this deck, but I know a lot of people are talking about it right now. I think it's Necroblom.
Oh, yeah. I haven't really looked into it either. I mean, it's Abzan, right?
Abzan, yep.
Yeah. I mean, here's the thing. Here's how you decide if your deck could run this. Are you ready?
Yep.
Do you run Entomb?
Yeah.
Okay, you do? Oh, great. Maybe you should consider this. It's like, because that's realistically what it is, right? The floor of this card is a 3 times as expensive Entomb. So, and I think that it's important that you think about that when you put this in your deck. You can't just be thinking like, oh, I'm only going to be playing this for all of its modes at all times. No. Because if you do that, like there's no point of you playing this card. You have to be able to get value in your deck out of the worst mode it can be played at. And I think that that's the 3 mana Entomb. So if you're okay with that, like, I mean, that's the thing though, is like, I don't think there's any CEDH player that would fight the fact that Entomb is a good card. I think that card is just incredible.
It's great.
And for the decks that want an Entomb effect, Entomb is incredible. I think that you start thinking to yourself like, okay, well, for those decks, like if a 2 mana Entomb exists, which it kind of does, would I play it? And then you have to think to yourself, okay, if a 3 mana Entomb exists, but also it could potentially win you the game sometimes for 5 mana, well, that sounds pretty spicy to me. This is CEDH. At the end of the day, we're looking for that ceiling. We're looking for that Magic Christmas Dreamland. The card has to be able to perform at a good rate, which arguable, and then it has to be able to like have that crazy high ceiling that can put you in the driver's seat, put you at that like 80% plus chance of winning the game scenario. And I think that this card can do that.
I actually think that you don't cast this for the first option more. I actually do think that I would see myself trying to use the second option more, the 4 costs, right? The 2 black and then, or the black generic, and then for an extra 2 to return up to 2 creature cards of 4 mana value or less, right? I actually see myself potentially doing that more with this card than searching things out.
See, but the problem with that one though is like, I guess I think of the floor as like the worst case scenario, you have the least amount of mana possible. Because to be honest, like if you're going to already pay the 4 to reanimate, like the difference between, we talk about this a lot in our pod actually, like the difference between mana values as it gets higher is lessened, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I hear you. Yep.
The difference between a 0 cost and a 1 cost is massive. The difference between a 1 cost and a 2 cost is big. The difference between a 2 and a 3 is, okay. 3 and 4, etc.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like at least in terms of the feel of the deck and how playable the card is, that's how it feels. So I think that at that point, if you're gonna pay 4 mana, 3 and a black, to return a creature or creatures from your yard, you might as well go search for the perfect one, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
for 1 extra mana. Because then at that point the card is like a spree of 1 extra mana, make this card perfect.
Yeah,
like. That's kind of how I see it. It's like, if you're not going to pay for the search, unless you're already in Super Magic Christmas Dreamland, which is exactly what you're looking for, is already in your yard. Maybe you already cast it Entomb earlier. I don't know. Then it's fine. But I don't think there's a lot of scenarios where you're going to be not paying for the search. Unless you're already in a really, really strong position, right? So like in Korvold, like maybe I would do it if I've already played my dockside and sacked my dockside. Yeah. But at that point, if I already got a dockside out there, y'all in trouble.
True. Also true.
Straight up, you guys are in trouble.
Also true.
So,
all right, Kyle. Obviously, we're pretty high on this card. We've talked about it for a while. So what point of mind do you think makes the most sense for its biggest downside?
I think it's the fact that it's a sorcery. I think that there aren't a lot of decks that nowadays want to win in their main phase. We're kind of in the meta where everybody's winning on top of each other.
Trying to, yeah.
And yeah, or trying to. And it's pretty tough to do that with this card. Like, sure, I can see worlds where people are casting Born and then doing this at instant speed, and that sounds crazy good. But at the same time, like, I just don't think that that's something that you're going to see often. So the fact that it is a sorcery, you know, it stinks. It stinks in terms of the number of decks that are going to have it see play. Because I think that, like, a deck like Korvold, for example, it wants to win in main phase. It's one of the few, like, main phase Adnaz decks out there. Like, you're trying to win in your main phase. And I don't see that as much these days. So maybe we won't see this card as often because people just aren't winning in their main phase as often.
Yep.
So yeah, what point did I make do you think is like the strongest point for Lively Dirge? What makes this card potentially a good card?
I really love that second mode. And so I think the fact that like you can pay the full 5 and basically as soon as everybody passes priority on this thing and this thing's resolving, like you're doing the thing. You're getting whatever card you want and then you're returning up to 2 cards without targeting it, right? Like, and so even if they try, like they can't respond to it. They have to respond to it before. They've got to like get that card out, and now you have more information before you even have to go do your search. If there are people responding to this card on the stack, like you have more information and now you can kind of make a more informed decision on what you're going to go look for and then what you are looking to bring back, right? Because they have tried to remove stuff from your yard in anticipation for what you're doing. And so I really love that about this card is that you're learning what your opponents are thinking about how you're going to win, right? And that's like really cool.
You can see their perspective.
Right? If you're trying to observe like what they're doing, it's like sometimes it's like, well, how are they assessing the threat right now? Is it like, oh, they think that this is how I'm going to win. So cool, I'm not going to win that way or whatever it may be, right? I just like that. This is a card.
It's not telegraphed.
It's not telegraphed, and they have to telegraph. They have to telegraph their thinking before you let this resolve, or they let this resolve.
Yeah, I kind of get what you're saying. Like, I think that this is one of those cards that's going to hit the board, and the table is going to have an immediate conversation. Everyone except for the person who cast it is going to be like, he's going to try to piece together this puzzle of like, okay, what are they trying to do with this? What are they going to get? Are we in trouble?
Right.
And I think that the second that conversation happens, I think that even as the caster of this card, you might get some information.
Yep.
Because at that point, the information might start flowing across the table. People could start talking about like what kind of interaction they have, even if they don't have an interaction with Lively. There's like sometimes you hear people be like, "I can't counter this, but I can help out later," right? And then that could help you decide what you want to get from Lively Dirge. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah.
So it's like, oh well, if I think that this person might have, you know, this one thing that can interact with me, well now I can pivot and get something that doesn't get stopped by whatever I'm guessing their interaction is.
I love casting the card that makes the table do that, and I hate being part of the discussion when somebody else casts that card and we're like, all right, everybody, what do you have? Like, you know, it's like, it's a great...
Yeah, sometimes the cards are on the table.
Everybody's like, oh shoot, look, I have 2 lands. You've got to take care of this, right? Like, you love being in that spot.
Yeah.
And so I think this card is one of those types of cards.
Yeah, for sure. All right, y'all. It's that time of the episode. Did I convince you? Wow, that was quick.
I won't make people wait on this one. Yeah, I think this is a pretty cool card. Like, I think that people need to be aware that it is a kind of a pricey cost to kind of sink in, but I think it can do a lot. And like what we just talked about, it gets a lot of potential information out of your opponents, and especially later game, which is where I kind of see this card being played more likely. That's like really valuable information.
It's going to get you good information, and if it resolves, it's at that 5-mana. It's at that perfect 5-mana mark we talk about. If it's a 5-mana card, it's got to win you the game, or at least put you in the driver's seat. And I think I guess I've convinced you that it does. Yeah. It does the thing. Cool. All right, y'all, say the thing.
That's a good card.
Thank you. Lively Dirge, that's a good card. You heard it here, folks. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Please check out our description below for our link tree, which will have links to all of our social media pages, as well as other places that you can find this podcast posted. We are currently on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Please follow us on X. We've been trying to grow our X following down there as well. And yeah, thanks again for listening, and we will see you next week.
We appreciate you. Thanks. Bye.